Two brothers once ruled London with charm in one hand and blood in the other. But how did the Kray twins become both legends and nightmares? And why do their shadows still haunt the city today? The fog rolls in low across the cobblestones, curling like smoke from a long extinguished fire. Street lamps flicker under the weight of cold mist, their glow soft and yellow, like old memories trying not to fade. Somewhere down the lane, a door creaks open. A laugh spills out, rough and familiar, the kind that belongs in a pub that smells of old beer and older grudges. This is East London, sometime between a pint and a punch. And tonight, like so many nights, two shadows lean against the bar twins born of blitz and blood, Ronnie and Reggie, names that hum like trouble when whispered together. They weren't big men, not in the way you'd expect muscle to weigh heavy in the room. But when they walked in, the air noticed. The noise dropped a few notches. The jukebox didn't skip, but the men beside it did, because the Krays didn't have to raise their voices. They brought silence with them, the kind that made your throat tighten without knowing why. Outside, the streets keep their secrets. The cracks in the sidewalk remember every boot step, every chase, every whispered deal under broken windows. Back then, the East End wasn't polished. It was brick and soot and war ghosts lingering in doorways. Children played where bombs had fallen. Mothers smoked on stoops while watching for more than just traffic. And in the middle of it all, the Kray twins were learning how to stare down the world without blinking. They weren't monsters yet, just boys in sharp coats with sharper edges. Ronnie, with eyes like glass about to break. Reggie, with a smile that could talk a priest into sin. You couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Even their silence matched. They didn't speak often in public, but when they did, it felt like a verdict. And the pub, that old place, with its stained floor and sagging ceiling, was their throne room. They never had to own it. It belonged to them anyway. Tonight, a man sits too straight near the back wall. Doesn't drink, doesn't laugh, watching. Ronnie sees it first. Reggie already knows. They nod, once, like old wolves catching the wind. Nothing happens yet. That comes later. For now, they let the tension settle, like dust on glass, like breath on a window before the scream. This is where it begins. Not in courtrooms, not in newspaper headlines. Here, in a place where the beer is flat, the smoke hangs low, and the brothers nobody forgets are still just a story sharpening its teeth. So, welcome to London. The air's thick tonight, and the twins are wide awake. They were born in the cradle of smoke and fire. East London, during the days when the sky itself seemed to hate the earth. Sirens weren't just warnings, then they were lullabies. Ronnie and Reggie came screaming into a world already shattered, where walls trembled in the night and the only light came from things that burned. Their mother held them close while dust rained down from ceilings. Their father, quiet and hard-knuckled, vanished when he had to, returned when he could, and never said more than he needed to. The blitz wasn't just noise. It was hunger, cold, and the sound of men being buried alive in their own beds. The Kray home had cracks that let in the wind, and rattled windows that never stopped shaking. But somehow, the boys didn't cry. Not much. They learned early that weakness got you less food, fewer blankets, and sometimes, a fist you didn't see coming. The streets outside weren't much safer. War had taken the rules and burned them. Gangs of boys ruled the rubble, throwing bricks like confetti, carving territories out of old alleys and train yards. Ronnie loved the chaos. Reggie loved the control. One was a storm with fists, the other, a general with a grin. They fought side by side, back to back, never needing to speak. Even then, they had that unspoken rhythm. Punch, duck, smile, run. By the time they were 10, they'd seen bodies in the street. Not just from bombs, but from beatings, from revenge, from debts unpaid. Nobody explained these things to them. They just watched, took notes. The world didn't soften its edges for children. so they learned how to sharpen theirs instead. Their grandmother used to say they had old eyes, eyes that had seen too much, too fast. Maybe she was right. They didn't play like other kids. Not really. They trained. Boxing gloves instead of marbles. Knives tucked in belts sewn by hand. They weren't waiting for peace. They were preparing for the next war, whatever shape it came in. And still, the house smelled of tea. Their mother tried to scrub the darkness from their skin with soap and lullabies. But the city had already claimed them. Each time a neighbor was carried out in a sheet, the twins learned something. Each time a copper turned a blind eye, they understood a bit more. Violence, for them, wasn't a stranger. It was a sibling, a third twin that followed them from crib to corner, from schoolyard to street. And long before the world knew their names, London had already whispered them into legend, not as children, not even as men, but as something else entirely, something born from sirens and silence, from broken glass and the smoke of 1,000 burning homes. Even as children, they weren't the same. You'd think twins would move in sync, think the same thoughts, mirror each other's moods. But Ronnie and Reggie, no, they were never mirrors. They were magnets, drawn together, yes, but with very different pulls. One was fire, and the other, smoke. One grinned while the other growled. And when the world looked at them, it didn't see two boys. It saw one question split into two dangerous answers. Ronnie was the storm. He didn't blink, he didn't bend. His anger sat just beneath the skin, always waiting for the smallest excuse to show itself. He had that look, the kind that made grown men look down at their shoes, even if he hadn't said a word. He didn't have to shout to be loud. His silence was louder than most fists. Reggie, though Reggie was the charm, he had a smile that could undo a lock. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, people leaned in. He could walk into a room and make you feel like the most important person in it, even if he'd forgotten your name already. He played the long game. Where Ronnie kicked the door down, Reggie was already inside, having a drink with the man who owned it. But here's the trick. They needed each other. Ronnie needed Reggie to keep the world from locking him away too soon. Reggie needed Ronnie to remind people that behind the smile was a threat you'd never want to test. They were a balance made from imbalance, a coin constantly spinning between reason and rage. They didn't just divide the world between them, they devoured it. One handled the face of the business clubs, meetings, champagne smiles. The other handled what happened when someone didn't listen. And when the mood shifted, it was hard to tell which twin you were really dealing with. Even their friends said so. You'd be drinking with Reggie, then the temperature in the room would drop and suddenly, you weren't sure who was looking at you anymore. Their mother tried to say it was just their nature, that some boys are born wild, others born wise. But the truth was darker. London had raised them with its fists. The war had whispered violence in their ears as babies, and the streets had drawn their map in scars, not stories, shadow and fire, one that burned everything in his path, and one that made you want to step closer just before it was too late. Ronnie and Reggie, two names, one legend, and every time they stepped onto the pavement, East London held its breath, because you never knew which one was coming through the smoke. They put on gloves before they ever held guns. The boxing ring came first, sweat and blood under flickering lights, the stench of liniment thick in the air, and the sound of fists meeting flesh like the ticking of a violent clock. Ronnie and Reggie didn't just fight. They studied it. Footwork, timing, how to let a man believe he was safe just before taking him apart. The ring was a school, and they were model students. Reggie moved like a dancer light on his feet, calculating angles, reading eyes. He didn't waste a punch. Ronnie, though Ronnie came like thunder, he fought like he didn't believe in rounds. There was no patience in his style, just pressure, constant, crushing, and absolute. The kind of fighter who didn't just want to win. He wanted to erase you. They trained in back alley gyms, places that stank of old socks and newer bruises. Their trainers didn't coddle them. No one did. You got respect by earning it with your knuckles. And the Kray twins earned it fast. People started talking. There's these two boys, twins, dangerous even when smiling, the kind you don't spar with twice. It wasn't just about winning. It was about learning control. Learning that violence, when timed right, didn't need to be loud. A jab could say more than a threat. A broken nose could close a deal faster than a handshake. And that ring, that circle of ropes and rules taught them where those rules ended. Outside the gym, those lessons followed. Only the gloves came off, and the brass knuckles came on. Because out there, in the streets and pubs and alleyways, it wasn't about points or trophies. It was about pride, territory, making sure no one ever looked at you like you were second. They didn't fight for fun. They fought for memory, for reputation, for the kind of fear that followed you like a shadow. The twins didn't walk away from boxing. They carried it with them, into clubs, into deals, into standover jobs and whispered warnings. The discipline stuck. The stance stayed. The knowledge of exactly where to hit a man to make him fall like scaffolding pulled at the wrong joint. People talk about how boxing builds character. For Ronnie and Reggie, it sharpened it, gave form to the chaos already inside them. It taught them how to hurt without hesitation, how to mask cruelty with precision. And it made sure that when the real fights came, the ones with no referee, no bell, no rules, they'd already won before a punch was even thrown. At first, it was all local. A few fights here, a few pounds there. Ronnie and Reggie were known faces in the boxing halls, tough kids from the East End with mean hooks and something colder behind the eyes. But fighting for trophies didn't feed the hunger that lived in their chests. They wanted more, and they weren't going to wait for anyone to hand it to them. The first hustle was simple: protection. That old trick dressed in new suits, a pub owner with a fear problem, a shopkeeper who heard too many footsteps behind him at night. The Kray twins offered peace at a price, a little money to keep trouble away, a little more if you wanted the right kind of trouble to visit someone else. And the thing was, it worked, because nobody wanted to test boys who already looked like they knew where you kept your secrets. Ronnie handled the fear. He'd stand close, too close, breathing slow and staring like he could see the last thought in your head. Reggie handled the charm. He'd shake your hand and smile, then casually mention the man down the road who didn't pay last week. The man who hadn't been seen since. They didn't need a gang, not yet. Just the two of them, side by side, walking into rooms with the quiet confidence of men who knew how to end things. Their reputation spread faster than their fists. Not because they were loud, but because they were consistent. If they said they'd do something, they did it. If they said they'd collect, they did that too. And if someone decided to test them, that person usually didn't make the same mistake twice. Money started to flow in. Not a flood, but steady. Enough to buy better suits, better shoes, and the kind of silence that meant no one asked questions. It wasn't about greed. It was about control, respect, the kind that made a man step off the pavement when he saw you coming, the kind that made grown men turn their backs and pretend they hadn't seen what they just saw. They still boxed, but now the real fights happened after the matches, in alleyways, behind pubs, in whispered phone calls made from red phone boxes. They weren't just bruisers anymore. They were building something, a name, a presence, an empire, still small, still growing, but dangerous, even in its youth. From the sweat of the ring to the smoke-filled corners of London's underbelly, the twins were stepping out of the spotlight and into the shadows. Not to hide, to rule, and everyone who mattered was starting to feel it. He wasn't loud. He didn't have to be. Uncle Charlie sat back in his chair with the kind of calm that came from surviving things other men didn't. His hands were always clean, his voice always low. But when he spoke, Ronnie and Reggie listened, because behind every quiet word was a warning. and behind every warning was a lesson shaped in blood. Charlie wasn't a gangster in the way stories like to paint them. He was old school, suits tailored, shoes shined, eyes sharp. He understood that violence without purpose was just noise, and noise attracted the wrong kind of attention. The boys had fire in their veins, but Charlie gave it shape, gave it discipline. He taught them that fear was good, but respect lasted longer. He showed them how to mix both like a perfect drink. They would sit around the kitchen table while their mum made tea, and Charlie would speak like he was telling ghost stories. But every ghost had a name. Every story ended with a man who forgot the rules. He talked about loyalty like it was oxygen, about reputation like it was currency, and about control. Real control, not with fists, but with patience, with planning, with silence that made people nervous. Charlie ran things you couldn't trace. Bookmaking, cards, whispers, passed between men in smoke-filled rooms. He knew how to move money without touching it, how to hurt someone without laying a hand. The boys wanted to fight. Charlie wanted them to win, not just for a night, for years, for a lifetime. So he gave them structure. He gave them the idea of the firm before it had a name. He didn't stop them from being who they were. That was never the point. Ronnie's temper, Reggie's ambition, he saw it all. But he shaped it, gave them rules they wouldn't learn in the streets. Never hit a man who's watching the door. Never threaten someone in public you might need in private. And never, ever, let emotion make the decision for you. That one was for Ronnie, mostly. Charlie didn't want glory. He didn't want the papers, or the clubs, or the headlines. He wanted the legacy. He wanted the name Kray to mean something in places most people would never walk. And the twins, for all their wildness, listened. Because Charlie wasn't just family. He was foundation. He was the quiet breath before the storm. And in a world where most men got their lessons from fists, the twins got theirs from whispers, from the man who taught them that business and blood were never separate things. They were just two sides of the same coin. And that coin always landed face up for those smart enough to know when to flip it. The pub wasn't just a place to drink. It was a fortress, a meeting point, a throne room without gold. And behind the bar stood the old man Charlie, senior father to the twins, quiet as stone, but with hands that could still break a jaw when needed. He didn't speak much, not about the past, not about the war, not about where he disappeared to when the boys were small. But when he was behind that bar, he was home. And when the Krays were in the pub, no one else dared call it theirs. It sat on a corner like it belonged there before the street was even built. Smoke stained the ceiling. The beer was always a little warm, but the air held weight. Deals were whispered here. Names were made here. And if you walked in looking for trouble, you rarely walked out looking the same. The regulars knew the rules. Pay your tab, watch your mouth. Don't touch anything that doesn't belong to you, including the Krays. Ronnie and Reggie held court without even trying. One leaned at the bar, eyes scanning the room like he was looking for an excuse. The other laughed with locals, buying pints and remembering names. But everyone knew this was their place. You didn't need a sign to say it. The silence when they entered said enough. The family sat deep in the bones of that pub. Their mum would sometimes show up, wiping dust off the stools like she cared what strangers thought. She did, of course. She always did. She taught the boys to dress right, speak clear, never slouch. Even in a world of blood and backdoors, she believed in dignity. And the pub carried that strange mix of warmth and warning like a fireplace with a gun on the mantel. Loyalty was built pint by pint. A favor here, a threat there. The butcher who sold them meat at half price. The copper who turned his eyes when needed. The gambler who always lost just enough. It was a web, woven slowly, but strong as iron, and the pub was its center. People would say later that the Krays ruled with violence, and that was true. But they also ruled with memory, with presence, with the kind of charm that came with clenched fists in velvet gloves. You didn't cross them because you didn't want to, because they knew your name. They knew your mother's name. They remembered what you drank and who you owed. That kind of power doesn't come from guns. It comes from chairs that always stay warm, from rooms where your footsteps are remembered, from old men behind old bars, watching everything with tired eyes and quiet pride. That pub wasn't just theirs. It was them. Stone, smoke, silence. A kingdom of beer and blood. And it would stand long after the shouting stopped. It started like most nights did. A few pints, a few laughs. Smoke thick enough to blur the mirrors and voices just loud enough to hide the warnings. The Kray twins sat near the back, boots on tile, eyes half closed, listening to everything without seeming to. The jukebox hummed something slow. A man was talking too much. Loud, drunk, and stupid. Every pub had one. This one had picked the wrong night. Reggie clocked him first. Not the words, but the tone, the slur of a man who thought stories were just stories, who didn't believe the warnings were real. Ronnie stayed quiet, staring into his glass like it held a reflection worth breaking. And then the man said the wrong name in the wrong way. There was no build-up, no shouted threats, no chairs scraped back in warning. Just one sound, the crash of glass breaking against a jaw, not thrown, driven. Ronnie moved fast. The pint glass didn't shatter in his hand, it shattered on the man's face. Blood bloomed immediately, dark and quick, running down over beer foam and teeth. The pub froze. It always did, when real violence arrived. It wasn't a fight anymore. It was a message. The man stumbled back, clutching his face, trying to find words that weren't blood. Reggie stood up slow, like a shadow stretching across the floor. No shouting, no chaos. Just purpose. Controlled, calculated. Together, they made sure the lesson stuck. One on the floor, one by the door. A rhythm, a ritual. And when it was over, there was more glass on the ground than in the shelves. Nobody called the police. Nobody ever called the police. The man was helped outside, but not before everyone saw what had been done. That was the point. The story would spread. It always did. A pint glass to the face. A warning turned to legend. And from that night forward, the Krays weren't just names. They were a presence, a reputation with sharp edges. Some say the man never spoke right again. Others say he left London entirely. Doesn't matter. What mattered was that from then on, the silence that followed the twins into a room got louder. Men stood straighter. Smiles faded quicker. And when someone mentioned the Krays, it came with a glance toward the nearest door. Violence was always part of their story. But this was the chapter where fear found its face, carved in glass, written in blood, and forever remembered in whispers. Bethnal Green didn't hand itself over. It was taken, one pub at a time, one silence at a time, one man who learned the hard way at a time. Ronnie and Reggie didn't come with armies. They came with presence, with suits pressed sharp and eyes sharper, with fists that had graduated from the ring and now delivered messages without words. The neighborhood knew them, knew their walk, their habits, the sound of their laughter echoing down side streets. What started as fear slowly shifted into something else. Pride, maybe. Loyalty, definitely, because while the twins ruled with power, they also ruled with memory. They remembered birthdays, helped families bury their dead, paid for groceries when no one else would. But underneath the charm was a promise: step out of line, and the street would swallow you whole. They weren't kids anymore. The softness of youth had been carved out by knuckles and fire. Ronnie's madness had sharpened, not wild, not yet, but unpredictable. And that made him dangerous in a way no one could map. Reggie, meanwhile, was strategy in motion. He didn't just want power, he wanted order. Legacy, a name that would last longer than bruises. Together, they became something Bethnal Green had never seen before. Not just thugs, not just businessmen, something in between, men who walked both sides of the line and owned it. Every shopkeeper knew their name. Every copper looked the other way just a little too long, and every rival kept quiet, even when their pride screamed to speak. But it wasn't enough. The thing about power is, once you taste it, the hunger never leaves. Bethnal Green was theirs, yes, but London was vast. Streets pulsed with opportunity, with weakness waiting to be exploited. The clubs in Soho, the gambling dens in Hackney, the whispers from across the river, it all called to them. Ronnie would stare at maps, not the kind in books, but drawn from memory. Circles and lines marking where they'd go next. Reggie made calls. Sat with men in dark rooms, measured risk like a banker measures interest. They weren't planning a future. They were building it, and still, they walked their old street like kings, handshakes from butchers, nods from tailors, wide eyes from children who didn't understand yet why their fathers went quiet when the twins passed by. The name Kray didn't just mean fear anymore. It meant control, structure. The kind of rule that doesn't need a crown, only a look. Bethnal Green belonged to them now. But they'd already set their sights further. Because kings of one street were never meant to stop walking, not when the whole city was still waiting to kneel. By daylight, they were polished. Clean-cut, well-dressed, all charm and courtesy. Reggie especially. He'd shake hands with bankers, smile for photographers, lean against polished cars outside nightclubs they technically owned. You'd see him and think, entrepreneur. Gentleman. A man who knew things but didn't need to say them. Ronnie, too, could turn it on briefly. Enough to pass in a room that mattered. Enough to keep the questions quiet. They were building something that looked real on paper. Clubs, security firms, even a few charity appearances. The Krays had gone professional. At least, that's how it seemed. But once the sun dipped behind the rooftops of East London, the masks cracked, the lines blurred, and what was business during the day turned bloody after hours. Because the twins understood something most didn't. They didn't need to choose between the boardroom and the back alley. They could have both, and they did. The clubs served cocktails and corpses. Deals were sealed in the same booths where dancers performed under spotlights. One moment, laughter and jazz. The next, a man being walked to the back with the wrong kind of hand on his shoulder. The twins didn't need witnesses, just silence, and they were very good at finding it. Reggie liked control. He wanted the illusion to last, wanted the firm to look clean enough for politicians and dirty enough for gangsters. That tightrope was his obsession. Ronnie, though Ronnie didn't care about illusions. He cared about loyalty, about revenge, about what happened when someone forgot which name ran the city now. There were quiet executions, not flashy, not messy if they could help it. A knife in the dark, a bottle to the skull in a car park. Sometimes just a disappearance, the kind that left a gap in the air where someone used to be. No fingerprints, no names on reports, just a growing reputation, whispered like a bedtime warning for grown men. And always, the same story played out. A businessman walks into a club. He shakes Reggie's hand. He nods at Ronnie. He thinks he's made a deal. Then, hours later, he's bleeding into the Thames or begging for air in the back of a butcher's van. Because legitimate was a word the Krays wore like cologne, visible, pleasant, and completely false. They smiled in daylight, signed contracts in daylight, posed for cameras in daylight, but their real work began when the curtains closed, and the city cold, gray, pretending not to notice let them do it. Because London didn't need to see the blood, it only needed to believe the twins were gentlemen, and the Krays, ever the professionals, were happy to play along, until the lights went out. It was velvet and smoke and danger dressed up in diamonds. The Gemini Lounge wasn't just a club, it was a stage, and the Kray twins made sure the spotlight always found them. Red carpets met wet pavements. Celebrities brushed shoulders with hitmen. You could hear Frank Sinatra on the jukebox one minute, and the heavy thud of a man being escorted out the next. The name Gemini suited it. Twin faces, twin truths. a world that glittered and bled in equal measure. Ronnie loved it loud. He'd hold court at the bar, laughing too hard, daring anyone to look away first. He liked the feel of attention, the buzz of being feared and adored in the same breath. Reggie worked the room differently, quieter, smoother, but no less lethal. A nod here, a handshake there, deals woven into compliments and champagne toasts. If Ronnie brought the storm, Reggie made sure the walls didn't fall down around it. It became the place, the kind where your name on the guest list meant something, where actors came to play gangster, and real gangsters came to watch them try. Politicians showed up too, tucked into corners, pretending they didn't see who was really in charge. And the press? They loved it. Snapped pictures of the twins in tailored suits, flashing smiles that didn't reach their eyes, called them gentlemen club owners, London's finest underworld hosts. But beneath the laughter and music was tension tight, silent, ever-present. Because the Gemini wasn't built just for fun. It was a machine, a place to launder cash, to gather leverage, to whisper in the ears of men who mattered. Every drink served came with a calculation. Every guest had a purpose. And the walls, though covered in velvet and mirrors, remembered everything. People disappeared from the Gemini. Not dramatically, quietly. A man might step out for a smoke and never return. Another might slip into a private room and come out with bruises and a new understanding of the rules. No one talked about it. Talking meant you might be next. And yet, they kept coming. Because power, even when laced with menace, is magnetic. The club was their crown jewel. Not the biggest, not the flashiest, but the first. The place that proved they could rule a city with charm and violence in the same breath. A kingdom of noise and shadow. And in its heart, two kings mirror images, walking the floor like they were born for it. The Gemini Lounge was a dream dressed in danger. And London, hungry and blind, couldn't look away. They dressed like royalty. Italian silk, gold cufflinks, shoes that shone even under the dull gray skies of East London. Ronnie favored bold colors, deep reds, navy blues, lapels sharp enough to cut. Reggie was more understated, more refined, but no less meticulous. Their suits were armor, their style a weapon, because appearances mattered. The Krays knew that better than anyone. Looking like a gentleman meant you could hide anything underneath, and they did. Behind every tailored jacket was a heartbeat that didn't flinch at violence. Behind every polished smile was the memory of blood. They didn't just dress for show, they dressed to mislead, to charm the press, to calm the nervous, to make the weak feel safe right before the hammer dropped. It was a game, and they played it better than anyone. But when the silk came off, when the club lights dimmed and the doors closed, the real work began. Ronnie was unpredictable. 1 minute laughing, the next smashing a bottle into someone's face just to prove a point. He kept a sawn-off shotgun close, not for show, but for punctuation. Reggie was cleaner with it. Gloves on, voice low, every threat folded inside a compliment. He didn't like mess, but he never hesitated to make one if it sent the right message. People feared them, yes, but they also admired them. That was the trick. The Krays made crime look like theater. They'd walk into courtrooms looking like film stars and walk out with juries smiling. Mothers whispered their names with a mix of dread and strange pride, and their enemies? They rarely got a second chance to feel either. You could be sipping a cocktail with them at the Gemini one night, and the next, find yourself waking up with a mouth full of blood and no memory of how you got there. That was the dance, the contradiction, the brilliance, polished in public, savage in private. Their enemies never saw it coming because the twins knew how to wear their masks so well. People forgot they were masks at all. They knew how to blend the lines, to sell an image so clean you never saw the knife behind it. In suits, they looked like kings. In silence, they moved like ghosts. And in darkness, they ruled. Because the Krays weren't pretending to be both gentlemen and gangsters. They were both. It didn't start with a ceremony. No champagne, no speeches, no oath over blood. Just a nod, a handshake, a shared look in a quiet room. That's how the firm was born. Not with fanfare, but with certainty. The streets already whispered their names, but now the whisper had weight, structure, a spine. The Krays didn't build an army. They curated a family. Men who owed them, men who feared them, men who believed in them. It wasn't about numbers. It was about loyalty. And that loyalty was bought with silence, respect, and violence when needed. There was no application process. You didn't join the firm, you were chosen. And once you were in, you didn't leave. Not breathing. Anyway, Reggie handled the structure. He made sure things ran on time, money flowed, debts were collected, favors were returned. He wore suits like a banker and ran the streets like a chessboard. Ronnie was the enforcer, the fire, the presence. You didn't just answer to him, you survived him. They gave orders in shadows. A look could mean a beating. A shrug could mean a body. But sometimes, all it took was their absence. The silence after a name was spoken in the wrong tone. That was enough. The firm became more than a gang. It was a system. Protection rackets, betting shops, clubs, security details, even political influence. Every man had a role. Every pub had a price. And every rival had a limit. They just hadn't found it yet. And yet, it wasn't all blood. There was a strange code in the firm, a crooked kind of honor. They took care of their own, helped with rent, covered funerals, sent flowers when it mattered. That was the paradox. You feared them, but you also needed them, because if you were under their wing, you didn't just survive, you belonged. Word spread fast. The Krays weren't just East End legends now. They were organized, professional, untouchable. Coppers hesitated, rivals reconsidered. Journalists tread lightly, framing their stories with just enough flattery to avoid becoming the next one silenced. And through it all, the twins stood at the center, mirrored, magnetic, unstoppable. The firm wasn't born in a blaze. It didn't need to be. It grew like smoke under a locked door. And by the time the city noticed, it was already inside the walls. Ronnie started seeing things others couldn't. Faces in mirrors that didn't belong to anyone in the room. Voices slipping through cracks in silence. One day he'd be holding court in the Gemini, laughing like a king. The next, he'd be pacing alone, eyes unfocused, whispering to ghosts that wouldn't leave him alone. Some called it madness. Others called it something worse, clarity, maybe, of a kind that comes only when the line between reality and rage wears thin. He painted sometimes. Strange, jagged shapes. Men with missing eyes. Empty rooms filled with color that didn't make sense. He said it helped, said it quieted the noise. But nothing really did. Ronnie's world was made of broken glass and unfinished sentences. And when it cracked hard. Reggie saw it happening. Watched his twins slipping, slowly, behind the curtain. And still he protected him. Covered the outbursts, paid off the doctors, softened the headlines. Reggie became the diplomat, the one who smoothed the wrinkles Ronnie left behind. With a smile, a favor, a threat wrapped in velvet. Where Ronnie inspired fear, Reggie built alliances. He met with judges, dined with businessmen, shook hands with enemies and turned them into pawns. He knew when to speak and when to listen. Knew how to turn Ronnie's chaos into leverage. Madness, after all, could be useful if you were the only one who could control it. But there were moments, quiet ones, when Reggie looked at Ronnie and didn't see a twin. He saw a storm, one that couldn't be stopped, only redirected. And deep down, he feared what everyone else feared, that one day, Ronnie wouldn't come back from wherever it was he kept going. Still, they were inseparable. Two sides of something no one could name. Ronnie the executioner, the fist in the dark, the artist painting with violence. Reggie the diplomat, the architect, the voice that said, "We're reasonable men," while cleaning blood from his cufflink. The city saw only what they were allowed to see. Headlines painted them as East End gentlemen. Rumors painted them as monsters, but the truth sat somewhere in between, split down the middle like the womb that once held them both. Ronnie's madness was not a flaw, it was a feature. And Reggie, ever loyal, ever calculating, knew how to make the world dance around it. One brother broke the rules, the other rewrote them, and together, they kept the whole of London guessing which one you'd meet next. It was the strangest kind of magic. Hoxton turned into Hollywood, lit not by studio lights but by cigarette embers and flashbulbs. The Kray twins weren't just gangsters anymore, they were famous. Movie stars dropped into East End clubs like they were visiting royalty. Directors, singers, models. All of them drawn to the danger like moths to the warm, flickering flame of chaos in a suit. Ronnie and Reggie stood at the center of it, tuxedos crisp, champagne in hand, smiling like they were born on red carpets instead of in bomb shelters. They'd pull out chairs for actors who played gangsters on screen, and those same actors would lower their eyes, because they knew the twins weren't acting. This wasn't pretend. You'd see it all in a single night. A West End darling laughing at Ronnie's joke while Reggie cut a deal 2 tables over. A chart-topping singer getting too close to someone who'd buried more bodies than he'd had drinks that evening. The club lights made everyone look soft and golden, but the men in the corners, the firm, kept it all in check. Because no matter how glamorous it looked, this was still their world. People said Frank Sinatra once shook Reggie's hand. Others whispered about secret meetings with producers, hush-hush chats about movie rights, memoirs, legend-making. It wasn't just that the Krays wanted fame, they understood it. They knew how to use it, how to wear it like another suit, another mask. And the celebrities? They loved it. They came for the thrill, stayed for the power. It was one thing to be adored by fans, another entirely to be respected by the most dangerous men in London. Being seen with the Krays was like being touched by myth. But there was always a price. Sometimes you didn't notice until you were too deep in the velvet and smoke. Ronnie, half in shadow, would lean close and say something that made even the most confident actors fall silent. Reggie, ever the host, would refill your glass while making you promise something you didn't realize you'd agreed to. It was charm. It was threat. It was everything London had never seen before. Hollywood had scripts. Hoxton had scars. And somehow, under the spell of the Krays, both worlds danced together. A party at the end of a knife, glitter floating just above the gutter. No one knew how long it would last. But while it did, it felt like forever. Like the East End was the center of the world, and the twins, those sharp-dressed kings of smoke and silence, were its brightest stars. They didn't need to chase the spotlight, it came to them like a moth to heat. One photograph, one whispered rumor, and suddenly the Kray twins weren't just gangsters anymore. They were headlines, magazine covers, dinner table conversation. Mothers who once crossed the street to avoid them now read about them in glossy pages, sipping tea while the twins stared back in black and white, handsome, dangerous, irresistible. The papers couldn't get enough. They called them charming rogues one day and blood-soaked butchers the next. That was the power of the Kray brand. Both sides of the story fit. They were gentlemen and murderers, philanthropists and predators. The truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the myth, and they fed it. Reggie would tip off reporters before certain arrests. Ronnie would strike a pose outside courtrooms, smirking like he was stepping onto a film set. Their mugshots looked more like album covers. They wore the notoriety like they wore their suits, flawlessly tailored, always intentional. Even when the press turned sharp, the twins sharpened with it. Because fear sold papers, and the Krays sold fear. Stories of vanished rivals, bodies never found, beatings delivered with a smile, all of it added fuel to the legend. Their name wasn't just known, it was branded into the city's skin. You could see it on the streets. Little boys mimicking their walk, shopkeepers using their image for protection, songs being written, slang being coined. and every time a journalist tried to tear them down, another brick was laid in the empire of their infamy. But it wasn't just reporters watching. Scotland Yard watched too. Politicians, rivals, all reading the same stories, all wondering where image ended and truth began. That was the genius of it. The Kray brand blurred lines until even the truth got scared of itself. Ronnie once said, "If you can't be loved, be feared. But if you can be both, you're a god." And for a time, that's exactly what they became. Gods in silk, gods with scars, worshipped and dreaded in equal measure. The Kray name no longer belonged just to them. It belonged to London, spoken in whispers, sung in pubs, printed in ink that never quite dried. And the brand? It didn't just rise, it ruled. It smelled of perfume, whiskey, and fresh blood no one ever talked about. Their clubs didn't just pulse with music, they throbbed with danger. You stepped behind those velvet ropes, and suddenly, the air got heavier. You weren't just in a nightclub anymore. You were inside their world. And in their world, rules bent like candle wax. Frank Sinatra once sat in the corner, sipping scotch, pretending not to notice the man being dragged out by the collar. Models, barely out of their teens, danced with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. There were whispers of royalty, of members of parliament sharing booths with men who'd snapped necks just hours earlier. And always, watching from the back or center stage, the Kray twins, Ronnie silent and burning, Reggie charming like the devil in cufflinks. A joke here, a threat there. Sometimes it was hard to tell which was which. There were nights when laughter filled the room, and everything sparkled. The band played, the drinks flowed, and London's elite rubbed shoulders with its executioners. But just as often, there were silences. Sudden ones. A man would be asked to step outside. He wouldn't come back. No one asked. No one blinked. Because in that space, silence was safer than curiosity. One story goes that a rising film actor cracked wise about Ronnie's temper, just loud enough to be overheard. The next morning, he flew home early, face bruised, contract canceled, never acted again. Another tale tells of a rival gangster found in the alley, his teeth scattered like dice across the pavement. No one was charged. The cameras had been turned. The staff hadn't seen a thing. Behind those velvet ropes, everything was illusion and precision, a dance of silk and steel. The lights made the walls glow gold, but behind the walls were rooms with locks, rooms where debts were paid in screams, rooms with drains built into the floor. Still, they came. The rich, the famous, the reckless, drawn to the Krays not despite the danger but because of it. To be seen in those clubs meant you mattered. To be welcomed meant you were protected, until you weren't. And the twins? They played host like kings. Ronnie's smile could freeze a man mid-step. Reggie's handshake could settle a war or start one. Every night was a performance, every table a stage. And behind the velvet ropes, the audience never knew if the curtain would drop or the floor beneath them. Because in those clubs, legend wasn't told. It was made. It began with a handshake, clean, firm, practiced. Not in a pub, not in a back alley, but in the quiet halls of old buildings with creaking floors and carpets thick enough to bury secrets. The Kray twins had crossed a line most gangsters never even dreamed of. They had a seat at the table now. Not the card table, the real one. The one where laws were bent before they were written. Politicians, nervous and ambitious, saw the twins not as criminals, but as opportunity. Reggie spoke well, dressed better, and offered things that couldn't be bought in shops or voted into place. Protection, silence, leverage. He smiled in rooms where others whispered, made promises without moving his lips. Ronnie was less subtle. He didn't trust men in suits who never had to bleed for what they owned. But even he understood the game. You didn't have to like them. You just had to know what they wanted. And then remind them, quietly, that you could take it away. So the Krays played host at dinners where wine was poured and decisions were made. Judges laughed at their jokes. Members of Parliament nodded politely as deals passed under napkins. No cameras, no records. Just a new kind of power, the kind that didn't need fists to do damage. Because once you own fear, the next step is owning favor. And the Krays did both. With every meeting, their legend stopped being underworld and started becoming policy. A nightclub license here. A closed investigation there. And slowly, London became theirs not just in shadow but in structure. It wasn't about votes. It was about influence. It was about knowing whose secrets weighed the most and where those secrets were buried. The Krays didn't need to blackmail. They just remembered. Faces. Mistakes. Quiet late-night conversations held a bit too close to their ear. And in return, they offered protection. Yes, but more than that, they offered certainty. In a world of shifting loyalties and public outcry, the Krays were the only constant. Brutal. Yes, but dependable. Some say one minister used their muscle to silence a scandal before an election. Another supposedly received campaign funds through a club front. None of it proven. All of it real. It was no longer just blood and clubs. It was policy, paper, and silence. And the seat at the table? They didn't ask for it. They took it, and no one dared pull it away. They looked the same, but the mirror was cracking. Ronnie would stare into it too long, eyes fixed, breathing steady, then suddenly not. He saw things in reflections that weren't their enemies, ghosts, himself multiplied. He'd mutter under his breath, or laugh out of nowhere. Sometimes, he'd smash the glass and say it had lied to him. Reggie would clean up the blood, tape over the frame, and never mention it again. But he noticed. The nights were getting longer. Ronnie paced more than he slept, talked more than he listened, whispered to empty chairs. He was slipping, and Reggie knew it. But what do you do when the other half of your soul starts to break? When your twin, your shadow, your brother, the one who always stood beside you, starts walking ahead, eyes wild, dragging you toward a storm. Reggie got colder, not cruel, just distant, businesslike. The smile stayed, but it didn't touch his eyes anymore. He started handling things alone, kept Ronnie out of certain meetings, began to clean the messes faster, tighter, with fewer questions asked. But that just made Ronnie worse. He felt it, the distance, the cold air between them that had never been there before. And the city noticed. The Kray twins still ran London, but now they walked slightly apart. Reggie's charm hardened into steel. Ronnie's fire turned erratic. Some of the boys in the firm started choosing sides quietly. And loyalty, once unshakable, began to tremble like a glass on a bar just before the first punch. It wasn't just about madness. It was about control. Ronnie saw threats in every glance, every word, not spoken. Reggie saw vulnerability in every outburst, every headline, every whisper that maybe Ronnie was no longer fit to lead. And in that unspoken tension, something dangerous began to grow. Not hatred, not betrayal, but inevitability, the kind that lives in twins who were always destined to burn twice as bright and half as long. The mirror never lies, but it doesn't always show you what you want to see. And now, when Ronnie looked into it, he didn't see Reggie standing beside him. He saw himself, alone, and for the first time, so did Reggie. It was a cold morning when the body washed up, face swollen, ribs shattered, shoes missing. No one claimed him, no one spoke his name, but everyone in the East End knew who he had crossed. The streets always knew before the papers did, and this time, even the silence felt nervous. The man had been a bookmaker, small time, paid his dues late once too often, said the wrong thing to the wrong person, maybe bragged that the Krays weren't as invincible as they acted. He thought distance could protect him. He thought wrong. For most of the city, it was just another nameless corpse in a place that had seen too many. But for one detective, new suit, clean hands, sharp eyes, it wasn't forgettable. It was a message. and, unlike the others before him, he actually wanted to read it. He started asking questions no one else had dared to. Not just who had done it, but why the fear kept it quiet. He noticed the witnesses who remembered everything until the name Kray was mentioned, then forgot how to speak. He traced the missing man's debts, his last calls, the way his family suddenly stopped talking, and then came the whispers, about clubs that only let you in if your soul had already left, about rooms with carpets too thick to clean, about a pair of brothers who smiled like saints and killed like devils. The detective didn't get scared. He got curious. That made him dangerous. Reggie noticed him first. Saw him waiting outside a club one night, not doing anything, just leaning against a lamppost, eyes watching. Calm, calculating. Ronnie called it nothing. Reggie called it the beginning. The firm didn't panic. They laughed about it at first. One copper couldn't bring down a kingdom, but Reggie, deep down, didn't laugh. Because kingdoms don't fall all at once. They crack slow, silent before they ever collapse. The body was just a warning, but not to the streets, not to the rivals, to the twins. The world was starting to look back. And this time, it was keeping notes. In the daylight, Reggie wore a suit so sharp it could cut silence. Cameras loved him. Reporters followed him like moths chasing a clean flame. He spoke in polished tones, smiled with just the right curve, posed outside his clubs like a man born for the spotlight. London saw a businessman, a gentleman, maybe even a local hero. The papers called him charismatic. The public called him bold. But when the sun dipped and the streets turned silver with fog, the mask slipped. Behind closed doors, Reggie's smile vanished. His voice lowered. His hands, once gracious with champagne glasses and handshakes, became instruments of warning. Or worse, by night, he enforced more than rules. He reminded people of order, his order. He could be calm one minute, crushing the stem of a wine glass the next. And if someone owed him, crossed him, disrespected him, they didn't get a second chance. They got silence, or bruises, or holes that no one would dig back up. This wasn't contradiction. It was survival. In a world built on fear, charm was camouflage, and Reggie wore it well. Even Ronnie, wild and unfiltered, respected that duality. He didn't understand it, but he respected it. Reggie could dine with actors at 7 and bury a man's future by midnight and make both feel like business. They called it the life, as if it were one thing. It wasn't. It was two lives, stitched together with secrets and silk. A tightrope walk between applause and accusation. And Reggie, he walked it like he owned the rope. There were whispers, of course. Some clubgoers claimed they saw him one night with blood on his cufflink. Others said he smiled too easily after a body disappeared. But none of it ever made the front page, because the press wanted a legend, not a killer. And Reggie? He gave them both. By the time the city slept, the double life had already bled into itself. The line between day and night, real and role, blurred. Until even Reggie, sitting alone in a quiet office, tie loosened, eyes dark, couldn't always tell which version of him was wearing the other. One face for the flashbulbs, one for the shadows, and eventually, both would want to speak at the same time. There were no handbooks, no pamphlets, no written rules nailed to a door or whispered down a hallway, but everyone in the firm knew it. The Gemini Code, born not in law, but in loyalty, etched in bruises, broken jaws, and the silence of men who once spoke too loud. No talking. That was the first and deepest rule. You didn't explain yourself. You didn't confess. You didn't even hint. If the police came knocking, you forgot your own name before you said theirs. Words were dangerous. Words were betrayal. And the Krays didn't forgive betrayal. Not even once. No weakness. That was the second rule. Fear was blood in the water, and the streets were full of sharks. You kept your chin up even when it bled. You laughed after being punched, nodded when given an order, and never, ever let your voice tremble. Weakness wasn't just frowned on, it was hunted, and no escape. That was the one people didn't understand until it was too late. You didn't leave the firm. Not really. You could disappear, maybe. Change your name. Move across the country. But they'd still find you. Not out of cruelty, but out of principle. Because if one man could walk away, it made the whole house shake. And the firm was built to never fall. These rules weren't preached. They were practiced. Every time someone took a beating and smiled through blood. Every time a body vanished and no one asked why. Every time a man got pinched and kept his mouth sewn shut, even when the walls closed in. That was the code. And once you lived by it, it owned you. Ronnie enforced it like gospel. Reggie didn't need to. His eyes were sermon enough. The others followed not out of fear alone, but out of belief. Because in a world full of liars, cowards, and desperate men, the firm offered something else, certainty. You always knew the rules. You always knew the price. And if you broke the code, you didn't get punished. You got erased. That was the power of it. Not just in what it protected, but in what it promised. You follow the code, you live like kings. You break it, you die like shadows. And in the heart of London, under the hum of neon and the weight of silence, the Gemini Code was law, even when the law forgot its own name. At first, it was just moods, swings, sharp turns from laughter to fury like someone had flipped a hidden switch. One minute, Ronnie was charming, dancing with a drink in hand and quoting poetry. The next, he was gripping someone's collar, eyes wild, talking about voices that no one else could hear. The twins had always been intense, but now something inside Ronnie was shifting, and not in a way Reggie could manage. Ronnie's sexuality had always made the city whisper. Not because it was rare, London had its hidden corners, its quiet understandings, but because Ronnie didn't hide. He flaunted it, dared people to react, dared them not to. And when they did, even with a look, even with a pause too long, he would explode. Not with words, with fists, with broken jaws, with silence that bled into screams. He didn't care about rules anymore. Not the unspoken ones, not even the ones he and Reggie had written in blood. He started making decisions on his own, visiting enemies in the middle of the night, calling meetings without telling anyone, pulling guns for reasons no one understood. Sometimes, not even he did. He began talking about secret plots, invisible watchers, betrayals that hadn't happened. His men, once loyal to death, started looking at each other with doubt. They didn't fear Ronnie less, they feared him differently. Not like a boss, like a bomb. One night, at one of the clubs, he sat in a booth alone, whispering to a cigarette that wasn't lit. Said the Queen had bugged the mirrors, that Reggie was slipping poison into his drink. He laughed after saying it, then cried, then punched a bouncer for looking too long. Reggie tried. He really did. Kept covering for him, smoothing over the madness with money and forced smiles. But even he couldn't stop what was unraveling. Ronnie wasn't just dangerous anymore. He was unpredictable. And unpredictability in a world built on fear and order, that's death. The firm began to split, cracks forming beneath the surface. Some blamed Ronnie, others blamed Reggie for not stepping in sooner. But everyone knew the truth, even if they wouldn't say it. Ronnie was spiraling, fast, and the gravity of his descent was pulling everything with it. The clubs, the money, the loyalty, the blood, and Reggie, for the first time in his life, didn't know whether to protect his brother or protect the world from him. It started simple. A quiet girl with soft eyes and a voice that calmed the edges of Reggie's rage. Her name was Frances. She didn't ask about money or blood or the firm. She only wanted Reggie, the real one, not the one in the papers, not the one with a gun under his jacket. With her, he could breathe, smile without calculation, think about a future that didn't smell like smoke and sweat and iron. But love was dangerous for men like Reggie. It meant choosing, and the moment he met her, the scales began to tip. Frances didn't like the clubs. She didn't like Ronnie. She didn't like the late-night calls or the bruises on Reggie's knuckles. She saw the shadows and asked him to step out of them, to be something more than half of a legend, to be hers. And for a while, he tried. He took her to the seaside, bought a cottage, talked about leaving it all behind, maybe opening something small, a restaurant, a bookstore, anything without blood in the margins. But Ronnie saw it, felt it, that soft distance in Reggie's eyes, the way his voice gentled when Frances was around, the way he stopped answering calls after midnight. Ronnie didn't say it out loud, not at first, but the air between them thickened, like a wire pulled too tight. One night, Ronnie cornered him, said Frances was a weakness, a danger, that she would unravel them both, that the firm came first, always had, always would. And Reggie? He snapped. For the first time, he raised his voice at Ronnie, told him he wasn't his keeper, that he could love someone and still be strong. But Ronnie didn't believe in balance. He believed in control. And love, to him, was betrayal, dressed in perfume. Frances felt it. She saw the tension growing like a storm behind Reggie's eyes. He stopped sleeping, stopped smiling. Some nights, he paced for hours, torn between the woman he loved and the brother who had built his world. The thing about love is, it makes you dream. And the thing about crime is, it kills dreams slowly. In the end, Frances faded, not because she stopped loving him, but because Reggie never fully left the life, and Ronnie never forgave her for even trying. She became the ghost between them, a memory wrapped in lace and regret. And Reggie? He kept her picture in his drawer, but he never spoke her name again. She sat by the window that night, staring out at the orange glow of the street lamps bleeding across the rain-soaked pavement. The house was too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath. Frances Kray, once Frances Shea, wore a silk nightgown Reggie had bought her during one of his better moods. The kind of mood where he promised change, promised peace, promised her a future that didn't smell of cigarettes and gunpowder. But promises, in the Kray world, were like smoke. They curled pretty in the air and vanished just when you reached out to touch them. Their marriage had never been a wedding. It had been a performance, champagne laced with fear, guests who smiled too wide because they knew who they were toasting. Frances walked down the aisle with shaking hands, and Reggie, despite his love, had already begun slipping back into the shadows. She had begged him, pleaded, some nights, with tears and trembling fingers, to leave the firm, to leave Ronnie. But Reggie was stitched too deep into that life. Every time he tried to break away, the thread pulled tighter. And every time he lied to her, something inside her withered. The pills were easy, a few here, a few there. For the nerves, she said. To sleep, she said. But sleeping had become a kind of dying long before the final breath. That last night, no one truly knows what happened. Some say it was suicide. Others whisper it was arranged too neat, too convenient, too silent. But Reggie never believed the first story, and never asked too hard about the second. He found her slumped against the pillows, skin pale as porcelain, the silence heavier than the walls could bear. She hadn't left a note. She didn't need to. Her silence was the message. Reggie didn't cry, not right away. He stared at her like he was trying to memorize the moment, as if by remembering it perfectly, he could undo it. But you can't rewind a life once the reel snaps. Something inside Reggie broke that night. Not loudly, not with screams, just a quiet fracture, deep and permanent. From that point forward, his smile dulled, his charm hollowed. He went through the motions, but the man behind the suit had vanished. Ronnie didn't mention her much, never liked her, thought she made Reggie soft. But even Ronnie noticed the change. His brother had become a ghost with blood on his hands. Frances was buried with white lilies and a guarded silence. And Reggie, he buried himself beside her. Only he kept walking. It happened in a room where the walls were dressed in red velvet, and laughter poured like gin. The kind of place where people wore smiles like masks and clinked glasses to forget the blood beneath their shoes. The Krays sat at a private table. Ronnie with his crooked grin and eyes that never quite blinked the way they should. Reggie beside him, quiet but coiled, watching every move like a man guarding both a throne and a brother unraveling. The rival's name doesn't matter now. It could have been anyone. Wrong face, wrong moment, wrong words muttered after one too many drinks. Maybe he laughed at the wrong joke. Maybe he forgot the rules. Maybe he thought East End loyalty came with exceptions. Ronnie didn't like exceptions. The room hushed before anything was said. Ronnie stood with the slow grace of a man who wanted to be seen, not hidden, not discreet. He walked over, calm as a priest, and stared at the man like he was studying an insect under glass. The rival smirked. That was the mistake. Ronnie didn't shout, didn't warn. He pulled the blade short, sharp and cold as East End air and drove it in, clean and deep, right below the ribs. Then again. Then once more, for punctuation. The smirk slid off the man's face and landed on the floor with the blood. People froze. No one screamed. Not at first. In a Kray club, you didn't scream when kings made decrees. Ronnie turned, breathing heavy, his shirt stained but his tie still perfect. He looked at the crowd, lips twitching in that crooked half-smile. "Anyone got something to say?" he asked. No one did. That was the thing about Ronnie. He didn't just kill with his hands, he killed with certainty. With the knowledge that no one in the room would dare lift a finger, not because they were afraid of death, but because they were afraid of disapproval. The body was carried out through the back door like last week's trash, wiped clean from the carpets, whispered away by men paid to forget. Reggie didn't speak much that night, just lit a cigarette and stared at his brother. Something passed between them, something ancient and wordless. Reggie knew the cost. And Ronnie? He didn't care. That was the night the smirk became legend, a grin carved into the city's bones. And every man who watched stayed silent, not because they were weak, but because they knew London had crowned its executioner. It was not rage that did it, not heat or vengeance or blind fury. It was quiet, cold, like turning off a light. Reggie sat at the bar long after the last laugh had faded. The kind of silence that hangs in rooms soaked in secrets, the kind of silence that feels like a dare. There were only a few left trusted men, loyal to the firm, and the one unlucky soul who didn't yet know he wouldn't be walking back out the front door. The man had crossed a line, skimmed money, whispered too loudly to the wrong ears, and thought his charm could save him. Reggie watched him talk, hands gesturing, voice slurred from drink, watched him smile, and something inside him snapped, not like a twig, like a switch. He rose slowly, without a word, and moved behind the man like a shadow slipping off the wall. No grand speech, no warning, just a single hand on the man's shoulder and the cold steel of the blade sliding in beneath the ribs. The man gasped once, a wet sound, then silence again. The others didn't move. No one screamed, no one begged. This wasn't panic. This was procedure. Reggie leaned in close, whispered something no one else could hear, then stepped back and wiped the blade clean with a linen napkin, folded it, placed it on the bar like it was a tip for the bartender. It was done. Blood pooled beneath the bar stools, slow, dark, almost dignified, and Reggie lit a cigarette like it was just another night. That was the difference between him and Ronnie. Ronnie needed the noise, the chaos, the crowd. He was a storm in a suit. But Reggie was the silence after. The others looked at him differently after that. Not with fear, at least not the loud kind. With respect. Because that night proved something. Reggie could kill too. Not in anger, but because it was necessary. Later, he'd ride home in the back of a car, city lights blinking past like slow gunshots. He wouldn't speak. Just stare out the window while the rain traced lines down the glass. And somewhere in that silence, a line was crossed. From brother to boss, from man to myth. And no matter how many suits he wore or how many smiles he gave the press, Something inside him would always stay beneath that bar, wiped clean, and waiting. Some places hold more than smoke and spilled pints. Some places remember. The pubs they once ruled with grins and threats began to feel different. Not louder, quieter. Like the walls were listening. Like the floorboards remembered where the blood had seeped through. Places that once laughed with them now flinched when their names were whispered. At first, they didn't notice. The drinks kept coming. The faces kept smiling. But under the surface, things shifted. The Gemini Lounge had a booth near the back, where no one sat anymore, not since the man with the glass eye vanished. The Queen's Head down the road stopped playing music on Fridays, said it was out of respect. Truth was, no one wanted to dance where someone had once begged. Even the 10 Bells, where they'd first made a name by cracking jaws and buying rounds, had grown cold. Not in temperature and spirit. People came and went faster. Voices dipped when they spoke of the Krays. And behind the bar, old men wiped glasses like they were scrubbing history off the glass. Ronnie liked to joke about it, said the ghosts owed him rent. But Reggie? Reggie listened. He'd stare at the stained wooden beams above the bar and wonder how many eyes had watched, how many mouths had stayed shut out of fear or favor. He'd trace the grooves in the tables and remember who had slammed their fists there, who had begged, who had died. Because the pubs weren't just watering holes, they were stages, and the Krays had turned them into theaters of fear. Now, the laughter that echoed wasn't theirs. It was nervous, short, the kind of laugh people let out when the devil walks in and buys a round. Their haunts had become mausoleums with beer taps, shrines dressed in jukeboxes and neon signs. And the men who once felt untouchable started to notice the eyes on them weren't admiring anymore. They were waiting for a crack, a slip, a ghost to step out of the wall and demand payment. The twins still drank, still smiled, still played the part, but the walls had changed. They whispered, they remembered, and every time Reggie walked out of a pub now, he didn't just leave with the smell of smoke on his suit. He left with the weight of 100 unsaid names trailing behind him. Like footsteps that didn't belong to anyone living. They threw the best dinners in London. Silver cutlery, silk napkins, roast duck, glazed just right. Champagne flowed like tap water. Laughter echoed off the walls. Men in tailored suits toasted empire. Women in pearls and furs lit long cigarettes and gossiped in whispers. The Krays knew how to host, but not everyone left with dessert. It became a pattern. Not to the guests, no one ever expected it, but to the few who watched the pattern unfold. The way a man would be invited, greeted like family, kissed on both cheeks by Reggie, given the best seat by Ronnie, offered the softest slice of beef, the finest claret, lulled, softened, convinced everything was forgiven. Then the room would shift. Not visibly, not loudly, just shift. The piano would stop playing. The jokes would dry up. The laughter would trail off like smoke through an open window. And the guest would notice too late that no one else was drinking anymore. That the smiles had frozen. That Ronnie was staring straight through him. That Reggie's hand had disappeared under the table. Sometimes it happened in the lounge, with music still echoing down the hallway. Sometimes in the garden after dinner, under the guise of a private word. And sometimes it happened right at the table. Silver carving knife still warm from slicing duck. A quick movement, a muffled gasp, blood on linen, then silence. Not always death, sometimes just a message. A broken hand wrapped in cloth, a missing tooth. But other times, most times, it was death, and the chairs were quickly rearranged. The blood cleaned by someone who'd done it before. The piano resumed its song. A new bottle opened, and the party went on, a little quieter, a little colder. Guests learned to laugh louder, to sip slower, to never mention names, to never ask, "Where's Charlie?" when Charlie hadn't come back from the garden. And if a man excused himself to the loo and didn't return, no one went looking, because dinner with the Krays wasn't just about business. It was theater, a test of loyalty. a stage soaked in wine and worry, and every invitation carried a silent question: will this be your last meal? But still they came. Politicians, celebrities, businessmen, rivals, all drawn like moths to a flame, hoping to be spared, hoping to be favored, hoping they'd leave with stories, not scars, because the food was excellent, and the price for declining an invitation, much worse than death over duck. They didn't call it extortion, not out loud, not to your face. They called it insurance. And in East London, if you didn't have it, you didn't sleep, you didn't open your shop, you didn't breathe easy. It started small. A pub pays a few pounds a week to make sure no one smashes the front window. A bakery slips an envelope into a pocket to avoid fires that start themselves. And everyone understood it wasn't about crime, it was about peace. Because when the Kray twins offered protection, it wasn't a suggestion, it was a rule. And rules kept the streets quiet. But quiet doesn't mean kind. By the time the brothers were at their peak, the entire neighborhood paid tribute like peasants to kings. Barbers, butchers, bankers. No one was exempt. Coins were dropped into pint glasses like tithes to a god. Markets were taxed, deliveries watched. Disloyalty punished not with a warning, but with a crowbar to the ribs. They called it the fear. Not just fear of violence, fear of being seen speaking to the wrong copper, fear of letting a name slip at the wrong party, fear that your cousin owed money and now you were part of the tab. It crept through alleys and into bedrooms, coiling around the feet of anyone who dared dream of saying no. Reggie ran the numbers with a smile. He made it look clean. Handshakes, contracts, envelopes exchanged at the back of clubs. But Ronnie was the shadow behind the deal. One glance from him, and a grown man would forget how to spell his own name. And that's how it worked. Terror dressed up in tailored suits. And the worst part? Some people wanted it. Because once the Krays insured your block, no one else touched it. Petty thugs stayed away. Junkies vanished. The Krays hated chaos. They wanted loyalty, not noise. And that kind of order? It had a price, so people paid, even if they hated themselves for it, even if they prayed for a way out. Because the alternative wasn't just losing your shop or your teeth, it was becoming an example. And the Krays didn't give second chances, only final ones. And in a city rebuilding after the Blitz, still haunted by the crackle of air raids and ash, fear was just another kind of currency. And Ronnie and Reggie, they printed it daily, with every fist, every threat, every shattered bottle on cobblestone. It was never about money. It was about control. It was no longer whispers in alleyways. It was files on desks, typewriters clacking late into the night, eyeglasses glinting under desk lamps in rooms far from East London. The Krays weren't just stories anymore, they were targets. And the eyes in the smoke, they weren't blinking. It began slowly, like all tightening nooses do. First, a beat copper who'd had enough. Then, a tabloid reporter whose brother vanished after crossing the twins. Then, a quiet voice from a government office that didn't like how many names kept showing up in both Parliament and police logs. One name kept surfacing, again and again. Reggie Kray. And beside it, always, Ronnie. But the Krays had grown used to watching the watchers. They had friends in high places, and favors owed in even higher ones. It wasn't paranoia if you were right, and Ronnie was always right. He said the walls had ears, and they did. The walls of every pub, every club, every room they thought was theirs alone. MI5 didn't knock on the front door. They sent whispers down corridors and asked the kind of questions that made informants sweat. This wasn't about petty crime anymore. It was about influence, power. Who had it? Who abused it? And what secrets were being buried under polished shoes and silk ties? Journalists dug deeper. Not the ones on the payroll, the ones too stubborn or too angry to take a bribe. The ones who still believed in truth, like it was a badge. One by one, they began pulling threads. A missing rival here, an unexplained income there, a nightclub bought in cash by someone who technically didn't even own a car. And the more they pulled, the more the Kray's empire began to twitch. The police? They were split, half terrified, half waiting for a sign, a green light, a crack in the armor. And when that crack came, it didn't roar, it hissed, quiet, patient, relentless. Reggie noticed it first. Men in hats standing too long outside his club, letters arriving late, friends returning calls too quickly, like they were eager to end them. Ronnie just laughed. "Let them come," he said. "Let them bring every copper in London. Let them bring the Queen herself." But even he knew the smoke was changing. The Krays had built their empire on fear. But fear only works in the shadows. And now, the lights were coming on. Not just flashbulbs from the press, but something colder, something official. Eyes that didn't blink, that didn't forget, that didn't flinch when Ronnie raised his voice or when Reggie offered charm like a blade wrapped in silk. The brothers stood in their club one night, whiskey in hand, silence thick between them. Outside, the street hummed like it always had. Inside, everything felt different. Not broken, just watched. And sometimes, when smoke curled up from an ashtray or drifted from a cigar, it caught the light in just the wrong way. Like it wasn't just smoke, like it was a signal. It happened in a flat in Stoke Newington. Not a grand finale, not a cinematic showdown, just a cramped room with peeling wallpaper, too much silence, and too many eyes trying not to meet each other. Jack McVittie had been summoned like a man dragged by the collar of fate, not knowing the trap had already been sprung before he stepped through the door. He thought he was coming to talk business, but this wasn't business. This was judgment. Ronnie was already there, pacing, breathing heavy, a storm waiting to be named. The others stood back, unsure if they were witnesses or accomplices or just statues made of fear. Reggie sat quietly at first, like he hoped someone would blink and make it all go away, but nothing went away anymore. Not the debts, not the betrayal, and certainly not Jack. Jack McVittie, cocky, careless, loud, a man who'd mouthed off once too often, who took money and didn't deliver, who forgot the kind of silence men like the Krays expected. He was never meant to live long, but even so, he didn't deserve what came next. Ronnie lunged first, no hesitation, a knife in his hand like it had always been there. It wasn't quick, it wasn't clean. It was savage, the kind of killing that silences a room forever. A dozen stabs, maybe more. No one counted. Jack didn't scream after the first few. He just went still, surrounded by a mess that soaked through the carpet and stained the walls of everyone watching. Reggie watched too, but his face didn't change. It was the same face he wore in photographs with mayors and movie stars, cold, distant, like his soul had stepped out for a breath of air. Maybe that was the only way he could bear it. Maybe that was the moment something in him cracked, and he just chose not to look down at the pieces. When it was done, no one moved, no one breathed. The air itself seemed to flinch. The body didn't vanish. It couldn't. The room was ruined. The witnesses too shaken to pretend it hadn't happened. The cleanup was clumsy. The alibis were paper thin, and the silence that once protected them now began to crumble, brick by whispering brick. Ronnie didn't seem to care. He lit a cigarette, sat in the corner like he'd just finished a painting. Reggie stood over the wreckage of a man and felt something twist inside. He'd kept the peace for so long, balanced madness with manners, but this wasn't strategy. It was suicide. The murder of Jack McVittie wasn't just another name scratched off a list. It was the last gasp of a legend choking on its own myth. It was the final note in a song played too loud for too long. That night didn't just end a life. It started a countdown. And somewhere, in the cold halls of Scotland Yard, a file was marked urgent. The Krays had crossed every line. But this one they couldn't walk back from. It didn't happen all at once. The unraveling was slow, like a thread pulled from a tailored suit, barely noticed at first. until the whole thing began to sag and fray. The Krays had ruled with fear, with flash, with the illusion of invincibility. But illusions are only strong until someone dares to speak, and someone did. Then another, and another. It began in quiet corners, in pubs where once the twins' names had only been whispered with reverence or dread. Now those same names carried a weight of exhaustion. The fear hadn't vanished, but something else had crept in behind it. A weariness, a question that echoed in too many minds. How much longer could this last? After Jack McVittie's death, the atmosphere in the East End changed. Not overnight, but unmistakably. Before, they had killed with purpose. Now it felt like madness. Before, the twins had been businessmen with fists. Now, they were ghosts haunting their own empire. The streets still carried their legend, but the myth was fraying around the edges. Even inside the firm, cracks began to show. The same men who used to shout their loyalty now spoke more quietly. The same eyes that once looked up in admiration now looked away. There were too many bodies, too many favors owed, too many questions no one could answer without risking their own skin. And then came the police, quiet at first, then bold. Detectives started knocking on doors with that soft, steady rhythm that meant, "We already know, we just want to see if you'll admit it." The Krays had always counted on silence. But silence only works when there's something worth protecting. And the firm was no longer a brotherhood. It was a burden. The first to talk wasn't a traitor, just tired. Tired of the blood, tired of the threats, tired of watching his mates disappear without explanation. He thought maybe if he told his story, he'd get protection. Maybe a deal, maybe just peace. So he spoke. Then another followed, and another. Each one gave the detectives a little more of the picture. It was like building a noose, strand by strand. Reggie tried to hold things together. He wore the same suits, shook the same hands, tried to flash the same smile, but something had changed behind his eyes. Ronnie didn't hide his rage anymore. He muttered to himself. He accused the walls of betrayal. His paranoia had grown teeth. The Kray twins had built an empire on loyalty and fear. But fear doesn't last forever. Eventually, it curdles into hate, or worse, into indifference. When the officers came with handcuffs instead of questions, it didn't feel like a raid. It felt like a long-delayed appointment finally being kept. They walked the brothers out in the daylight. No disguises, no glamour. Just two men who had stayed too long at their own party. The empire didn't fall with an explosion. It simply came apart, one voice at a time. He had been with them for years. Knew the rhythm of the room before anyone spoke. Knew where the bodies were buried because he had helped dig the holes. At one time, he would have killed for the twins without flinching. But times change, and so do men. No one saw it coming. That was the thing about betrayal, it never came from across the street. It always came from the chair next to yours. The man who laughed with you, drank with you, bled with you. The one you thought was bound by the same code. The one who watched you sleep with a loaded pistol on the nightstand and never said a word. Now he was saying words. To the police, to the press, to anyone who would listen. At first, they didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. Not him, not someone who knew the twins as brothers. But the facts piled up like corpses in a lockup. Names, dates, locations. Specifics no outsider could know. He handed over stories that were never meant to see daylight. Things only told in hushed voices behind locked doors. Murders dressed up as business. Deals sealed with blood instead of ink. They say he did it for a deal. A lighter sentence. A chance to disappear. Maybe he did. Or maybe it was survival. Maybe he looked at Ronnie's spiraling madness, at Reggie's dead eyes, and realized the ship was going down fast, and no one was coming to save the crew. The betrayal stung not just because of what he said, but because of who he was. He had stood by their side when the world feared the Krays, when men crossed the street just to avoid eye contact. He had cleaned the blood off the floor and never asked whose it was. He had stood guard while Ronnie paced like a lion, muttering about enemies that didn't exist until they did. Now he sat across from detectives with a cup of tea and told them everything. Ronnie wanted him dead. Of course he did. Raged like a caged animal. Promised fire, knives, revenge. But it was too late. The moment the words left the betrayer's lips, the game changed. It wasn't just street gossip anymore, it was testimony. The kind that sticks. The kind that gets written down. The kind that juries believe. Reggie didn't speak much about it. Didn't have to. The betrayal had sunk deeper than words. It was there in the silence. In the way he stared at the wall for hours. In the way he stopped returning certain calls. He knew the world had shifted under his feet. That a man they had once trusted with their lives had handed those lives over on a silver platter. Not with a gun, not with a blade, but with memory. That was the most dangerous weapon of all. Because when the stories finally came out, the public didn't see legends anymore. They saw monsters. And monsters don't get second chances. It didn't come in the dead of night. It came just after dawn, when the city was still shaking off the cold and the pubs hadn't yet opened. The kind of hour when most of London still sleeps, but the law wakes with a warrant in one hand and a sledgehammer in the other. There were no warning knocks, no polite introductions. Just the crash of doors kicked in, boots on floorboards, and the sound of shouting echoing down once quiet streets. The raid wasn't small. It wasn't subtle. It was a message. This time, the law came heavy. Multiple homes, all at once. The Kray strongholds. The flats they thought were safe. The hideouts they assumed were untraceable. Every address they thought was theirs by blood and fear was suddenly flooded with officers who had waited years for this. Men in plain clothes and others in tactical black, pouring through doorways, tearing through wardrobes, flipping furniture like it owed them answers. Ronnie was the first to scream. Not words, just rage. A guttural roar, half beast, half fury, that sent one officer stumbling back before the others pinned him. His hands fought, but his mind was somewhere else, shouting about conspiracies, about betrayals, about ghosts and traitors with badges. They cuffed him while he cursed names that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. Names of the dead. Names only he and Reggie remembered. Reggie was quieter, not calm but controlled. He didn't flinch when they came through the door, didn't argue, just stared, watching, measuring the faces of the men who dared step into his home with dirt on their boots and law on their lips. When they pulled his arms behind his back, he didn't resist. He just whispered something under his breath, too low to catch, but loud enough to chill. In the kitchens, they found ledgers. In the bedrooms, guns. Under floorboards, envelopes fat with cash, and photographs that told stories no one wanted written down. Faces marked for silence. Deals inked in blood. Evidence finally. Proof. But the real damage wasn't in what they took. It was in the noise. The neighbors heard everything. So did the reporters. Word spread faster than fire in dry grass. By noon, the streets buzzed with whispers. By nightfall, it was headlines. The Krays had fallen. Not with a gunfight, not with a blaze of glory, but with handcuffs and paperwork, and the quiet satisfaction of a detective who had waited too long for this day. There were those who said it was about time. Others who still couldn't believe it. But one thing was certain. The empire built on fear, charm, and the illusion of invincibility had just been dragged into daylight. And it didn't look half as dangerous under the Sunday. The firm was crumbling. And the boys who once ruled East London with glassy smiles and sawn-off shotguns were now just suspects, criminals, mugshots in tomorrow's paper. The fall had begun, and the streets would never forget the sound it made. It wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a stage. Cameras lined the steps outside. Reporters packed the benches inside. Every seat filled, every eye watching. And in the center of it all, Ronnie and Reggie Kray, dressed like kings, cuffed like criminals. The trial of the century had begun. and the twins played their parts to perfection. Ronnie arrived first, his suit immaculate, his stare defiant. He scanned the room like he owned it, like the judge was just another barman waiting for instructions. Reggie followed, quieter, sharper. His eyes flicked to every juror, every solicitor, every silent enemy hidden behind a polite expression. He didn't speak, but his silence had weight. The charges read like a list of sins passed down from the East End itself. Murder, conspiracy, intimidation, extortion. They weren't just on trial for what they did. They were on trial for everything they had made London believe they could do. This was about control, about fear, about legend meeting law. The evidence came in waves. Witnesses whispered names they had sworn never to repeat. Tape recordings played like ghosts confessing from beyond the grave. Ledger entries, coded notes, bloody clothes. All of it laid bare. Reggie would sometimes shake his head slowly. Ronnie would laugh. Not big laughs, just those little scoffs, as if he couldn't believe the world still thought it could judge him. There were moments the courtroom went silent, not because the judge called order, but because someone had just said something so terrible, so clear, that no one knew how to breathe afterward. Like when they described how Reggie had looked Jack McVittie in the eyes before the knife went in, or when Ronnie's name was linked, calmly and coldly, to a string of unsolved beatings that stretched back years. Their mother came, sat in the back, dignified, fragile, watching her boys disappear beneath words like premeditated and psychopathic. She never cried in public, but her hands trembled, ever so slightly, every time a photograph was shown. And yet, the brothers didn't flinch. Ronnie turned to the press more than once and winked. Reggie sat upright, like a soldier awaiting orders. The trial dragged on, day after day. It became theater. Street kids hung outside just to get a glimpse. Women blew kisses as they were led to the van. Grown men argued over whether the Krays were villains or victims of their own myth. But the jury didn't care about myth. When the verdict came in, it hit like a funeral bell. Guilty, both of them. Life sentences. The courtroom held its breath. And then Ronnie smiled, full teeth, wide and wild, like he'd just won something the rest of them couldn't see. Reggie closed his eyes, just for a second, just long enough to picture the streets, the pubs, the nights that were now gone forever. And so ended the performance, not with applause, but with the sound of a gavel falling like a coffin lid. He said he didn't do it, said it over and over, said it with calm eyes and a tired mouth. Reggie Kray, suited, clean-shaven, polite to the guards, stood before the world and insisted, "I didn't kill Jack McVittie." He said it to reporters, to the priest who visited, even to his own reflection on the cold metal wall of his cell. But no one believed him anymore. Not really, because by the time Reggie started repeating that lie, the world had already made up its mind. The trial was long over. The ink on the sentence had dried. The headlines had faded into books and documentaries, but Reggie still clung to that last thread of denial, as if by holding it long enough, the rest would unravel and fall away. He said he had been pushed, that Jack had provoked him, that it wasn't planned, that he wasn't the man they painted him to be. But the facts didn't blink. The facts didn't care. Blood doesn't wash out of a story just because the storyteller wants it gone. The night of the murder was no longer a secret. Too many voices had cracked open the walls. Too many whispers had turned into testimony. Reggie had invited Jack to what was meant to be a warning, but something snapped. Maybe it was Francis's death still burning in his bones. Maybe it was years of loyalty unraveling. Or maybe Reggie had finally crossed the point of no return without realizing he'd done it. The knife had gone in. Once, twice, more. And when Jack stopped moving, Reggie had just stood there, breathing heavy, not looking away. That's what they said in court. That's what the others remembered. But in prison, Reggie told it differently. He would talk about fate, about how some men are born into a corner, and they just learn how to punch their way out. He'd say Jack was a mistake, a moment, a regret, but not a cold-blooded execution. He'd say he wasn't like Ronnie, that he was the good twin, the cleaner one, the one who might have made it out, if only the timing had been better. Some wanted to believe him. People like to believe in tragic figures. They want a villain who reads poetry, a killer with a conscience, and Reggie knew how to feed that need, just enough. He'd sign books with kind words, smile for old fans, talk softly in interviews, always sharp, always measured. But behind his eyes was the truth, and it never left. Because at night, in the silence of the cell, when the lights dimmed and the guards stopped checking as often, Reggie would sit on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, not crying, not praying, just staring, like he could still see the moment it all fell apart. The blood, the scream, the stillness. He never stopped saying he didn't do it, and maybe he even convinced himself. But the ghost of Jack McVittie never left the room. He was no longer a man, not in the way the world once knew him. Ronnie Kray, the feared, the unpredictable, the co-king of the East End, sat behind thick glass, eyes darting like a trapped animal, yet still somehow bored, declared insane, locked away in Broadmoor. But even madness could not strip him of the need to command. The first time they told him he wasn't going home, he laughed, a slow, dragging laugh, the kind that made the room colder. He thought it was a joke, thought they were just trying to scare him, thought the doctors were part of the game. But days passed, then weeks, and the bars never opened. He was used to command, used to fear doing the heavy lifting for him. But now, the guards didn't flinch when he stared. The nurses didn't bow when he barked. They called him Ronald. No respect. Just clinical detachment, like he was a specimen. And maybe he was. His file thickened with words like paranoid schizophrenia, violent episodes, and delusional authority complex. But to Ronnie, he wasn't sick. He was awake. Awake in a world full of sleepwalkers. Still, he tried. Even in chains, he tried to rule. He organized tables in the common room, like meetings of the firm. He appointed lieutenants among the more pliable patients, whispered orders, demanded silence, punished disrespect with plastic cutlery and screams in the night. The staff called them incidents. Ronnie called them discipline. He wrote letters to Reggie, telling him to stay strong, to remember who they were. But the tone shifted. The more time passed, the more unstable the writing became. One letter would be full of love, the next full of rage. One moment he would weep, calling Reggie his other half. The next, he would accuse him of betrayal, of stealing the crown. Even his own mirror image had started to look like an enemy. He claimed he saw things, spirits watching, enemies whispering in the vents. He said Broadmoor wasn't a hospital, it was a fortress, a prison run by ghosts and cowards. And in his mind, he was still in charge, still feared, still the boss. The doctors would note it as a grandiose delusion. But he didn't care. If no one listened, he'd rule in silence. He would sit on the edge of his bed, hands twitching, voice murmuring names from the past. George Cornell, Jack McVittie, Francis. He'd recite their names like prayers or curses. No one could tell which. Sometimes he'd laugh for hours. Sometimes he'd cry without sound. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, he'd scream for Reggie, not to come break him out, just to remember. To remember that once they were gods in suits. But gods don't get locked behind glass. And Ronnie Kray, for all his fury, was now just another broken man in a padded room trying to rule a kingdom that only existed in his mind. Reggie Kray walked into prison wearing a tailored suit and the weight of 1,000 secrets. The cell door clanged shut behind him like a final punctuation mark on the sentence he'd been writing his whole life. He wasn't just a prisoner now, he was a symbol, a myth caught in concrete and iron. But myths don't bleed. and Reggie did. At first, he carried himself like he always had, chin up, shoulders back, calm voice, sharp eyes. The guards gave him space. The inmates gave him silence. Everyone knew who he was. Not just Reggie Kray, the Reggie Kray, one half of an empire built on charm and blood. Even the bricks of the prison seemed to whisper his name. But time has teeth. It bites slowly, then all at once. The months turned into years, and the legend began to fade. Suits became uniforms. Whiskey became water. Late-night banquets turned into early morning roll calls. There were no phones ringing for favors, no friends slipping envelopes, just fluorescent lights and echoes. He missed silence the most, the kind you earned after handling a problem. Now, the silence was hollow, powerless. Reggie still walked like a boss, still kept to his schedule, still read the papers, still shaved every morning as if he were getting ready for a meeting back at the Double R Club. But the mirror told a different story. Wrinkles deepened, the eyes dulled, the voice cracked just a little more each winter. The man who once ordered executions now stood in line for toothpaste. He thought often of Ronnie, wondered what Broadmoor had done to him, wondered if they were feeding him properly. Writing letters helped, at first. But Ronnie's replies had grown stranger, less tethered to reality. One letter claimed he'd seen the Queen, another said he was being visited by angels, and then, silence. The kind that doesn't come from peace, but from breakdown. Reggie paced his cell some nights, remembering Frances, remembering the way she smiled when the cameras weren't around, remembering the way she screamed. He told himself she died from sadness, but deep down, he knew he'd fed the sadness every day. Guilt lived just under the surface, like a bruise that never healed. And yet, even in prison, Reggie found ways to command respect. He broke up fights. He mediated between gangs. He offered protection to the weak, not for money, not for leverage, but because that's what kings do, even dethroned ones. But change, real change, that came slow. He spoke softer, slept lighter, thought longer before he spoke. But the ice never fully melted, not inside. Because a man who spent his whole life sharpening blades doesn't forget the sound they make when they sink in. They say prison either breaks you or rebuilds you. For Reggie, it did both. It stripped the suit and showed the scars. It dulled the violence, but left the hunger. He was no longer feared like before, but still remembered. That was enough for a while, but not forever. The Kray Empire had once felt immortal, like fog rolling over the East End, constant, untouchable. But once the brothers were locked away, the fog began to lift, and what it left behind wasn't power. It was cracks, splinters, ghosts. Without Ronnie's rage and Reggie's cold control, the firm didn't just stumble, it bled. The men who once swore oaths over whiskey and blood started to drift. Some vanished, some turned. Some just stopped picking up the phone, because the voice on the other end was no longer terrifying, it was distant, caged, echoing through prison bars like a legend out of breath. At first, the Krays tried to rule from behind the glass. Visitors passed messages, guards were bribed, orders were slipped into letters written in code. But distance changes things, so does time. And fear, without teeth, is just noise. With the heads cut off, lieutenants rose, but none of them had the stare. None had that perfect mix of charm and cruelty that made people love you and fear you in the same breath. There were fights over turf, whispered threats, power plays. The Kray name still carried weight, but not like before. Now it was a shadow used by others. A tool, a brand slapped onto things the twins never touched. The Gemini clubs closed their doors. Their old haunts grew cold. The back rooms that once echoed with deals and danger turned quiet. The chairs stayed empty. The curtains collected dust. No one wanted to risk being associated anymore. Not with the walls closing in. Not with detectives still poking around and reporters still hungry for scraps. And then came the silence. It didn't come all at once. It crept in. First through the front pages, no more photos of the twins smiling in court or rumors of celebrity visitors. Then through the streets, no more name-dropping at bars, no more threats wrapped in nostalgia. The firm faded, not with a war, but with a whimper. A few tried to carry on in the Kray tradition, but the times had changed. Violence had become louder, messier. The new breed of gangsters didn't want suits and handshakes. They wanted flash, speed, firearms instead of fists, deals made in alleyways, not parlors. The old codes didn't hold. The old names didn't scare. The firm became history while still technically alive. And deep in their cells, Ronnie and Reggie could feel it. Like royalty exiled to a far-off land, they watched their kingdom rot. They tried to write letters, tried to send warnings, but the streets didn't answer anymore. Loyalty had turned into myth, respect into rumor. The empire had not just lost its head, it had lost its soul. The Krays once believed fear could outlive flesh, but empires don't fall because their enemies rise. They fall because the silence grows louder than the name. They were locked away, but never out of sight. The walls couldn't keep their names from bleeding through. Ronnie and Reggie Kray, the twin ghosts of London's underworld, still smiled from the pages of newspapers, still whispered from television sets like bedtime monsters that refused to be forgotten. The tabloids feasted, and the twins, even behind bars, fed them willingly. Every letter from prison, every rumor of a visitor, every photograph that surfaced, it all became ink. The Krays weren't just inmates. They were a brand, a bloody legend, and the press knew that legends sold. There was Ronnie, glassy-eyed and grinning from Broadmoor, spouting prophecies about the return of honor, giving interviews through intermediaries, his madness now part of the performance. Journalists couldn't get enough. He called himself a soldier, called himself misunderstood. He claimed the world had changed, but that he hadn't. And in a way, that was true. His eyes still burned with the same kind of fire, the same violence that once lit up clubs and alleyways. But now, it flickered behind medicated fog and bulletproof windows. And there was Reggie, more reserved, more polished, writing books, giving quotes, reinventing himself as a man of reflection, not revenge. He played the remorseful figure, the brother who could have gone straight, the tragic twin dragged down by loyalty and blood. The media played along. Some bought it, others didn't. But it didn't matter. His story still sold. Every tabloid editor knew the formula. A photo of the Krays, young and sharp in tailored suits. A headline with the word killer or kingpin. A few words about their crimes, then a deep dive into what they were eating for breakfast in prison, who was visiting them, which celebrities still spoke to them. It wasn't journalism, it was theater, and the twins were still the stars. The fascination never faded, not entirely, because in a strange way, they had become part of British pop culture. The Krays weren't just criminals, they were icons. Their rise, their reign, their fall, it all had the pacing of a movie, a tragedy dressed in Armani, and the people kept watching, kept reading, kept remembering. The twins knew it too. They played their parts. Reggie would grant a rare interview, speak softly about family, justice, and change. Ronnie would scribble down his visions, his hallucinations, his twisted philosophies. Both wanted control. Even if they couldn't control the streets, they could still control the narrative, the myth. And so the stories kept coming. Some true, some not. Some written by those who feared them, some by those who loved them. But all of them kept the Kray name alive, long after the empire had crumbled. Even in chains, even as old men in dying bodies, the twins still haunted the tabloids. Because some faces don't fade, some names won't go quiet, and some legends, no matter how dark, are too good to bury. They said he died peacefully. But peace was never part of Ronnie Kray's vocabulary. Not in the way he lived, not in the way he ruled, and certainly not in the way he unraveled. When the end came, it did not come with violence, not with broken glass or screams behind a club. It came in silence inside the cold, medicated walls of Broadmoor, beneath soft white sheets, in a room padded against his own rage. By the time the final day arrived, the man who once terrified a city was barely more than a memory of himself. The pills had dulled him. Years of injections and observation had wrapped him in a fog he could never fight his way out of. His fists, once feared across East London, now trembled not from anger but from age. He was still Ronnie, still a Kray, but the world outside had moved on. And inside, so had he, in his own way. Some nurses said he mumbled to himself, said he still spoke about honor, about soldiers, about enemies that weren't there. He saw ghosts, maybe ones he made, maybe ones he'd become. He talked about the war, the one that never ended, the war in his mind. Sometimes he'd grin, wide and crooked, like he knew something no one else did, like the padded room was just another battlefield, and he was still winning. But in truth, he was losing, had been for years, not just to the drugs, or the psychiatrists, or the locked doors that would never open for him again, but to time. Time was the one gangster Ronnie could never outsmart. It took his fire and left behind smoke. It took his body and left behind a shell. There were no visitors at the end. Not really. Family came and went, but the crowds were gone. No more photographers lurking at the gates. No more headlines asking what Ronnie Kray had to say this week. The world had grown tired of his madness, even if it once adored the spectacle of it. And so, the final curtain fell in a quiet place, far from the clubs and cobbled alleys he once ruled. When the nurse checked on him that morning, his eyes were closed. The rise and fall of his chest had stilled. One hand rested gently on his stomach, the other clenched, even in death, as if he'd gone out the way he came in, ready for a fight. They wrapped him carefully, not out of respect, but out of procedure. The paperwork was filled, the file closed. Another number in the system, another name tagged for cremation. But he wasn't just a name. Not to London, not to the people who remembered the fear, the swagger, the violence dressed in velvet. Ronnie Kray, the mad twin, the self-declared general of a war only he could see, was gone. No headlines that day, no public mourning, but somewhere, in the hush of an old East End pub, maybe a glass raised itself a little higher, not in honor, not in grief, just in memory, because even padded silence can echo. When the gates finally opened for Reggie Kray, there was no victory in it, no crowd cheering, no family waiting with open arms. Just the slow shuffle of an old man walking out into a world that no longer needed him. He was released not because he'd earned it, not because he'd changed, but because his body had begun to betray him. The word they used was compassion. But compassion is not the same thing as forgiveness, and it certainly is not freedom. The doctors had found it cancer, deep and aggressive. It was eating him from the inside, the way guilt never could. The courts, always so eager to make examples, made one final exception. They let him out, not to live again, but to die somewhere quieter, somewhere softer than a prison cell. His release was stamped, filed, signed by men in suits who never knew the smell of blood in back rooms or the sound of bone breaking under orders. To them, he was an aging inmate with a ticking clock, a risk that had lost its teeth, but Reggie knew better. He knew what that gate truly meant. It meant the end, not the beginning, not a second chance. He walked out holding a bag of clothes, some pills, and lungs that struggled to remember what fresh air felt like. The streets of London had changed. The pubs were full of strangers. The alleys that once whispered his name had fallen silent. He passed newsstands without headlines. His legend had yellowed like old paper. He was placed in a hospice. Not a home, not really. Just a final waiting room dressed in pastels and false cheer. The nurses were kind. The food was soft. The bed was warm. But none of it could reach him. He stared out the window most days, said little, thought too much. Some nights, they said, he spoke to someone who wasn't there. Maybe it was Ronnie. Maybe it was Francis. Maybe it was the younger version of himself, still laughing in silk shirts, still believing he could rewrite the rules of power. The tabloids made noise for a moment. Pictures of the frail man who once ordered executions with a nod. Speculation. Debate. Was it right to let him go? Did the devil deserve a soft death? But the papers moved on, as they always do, and Reggie faded day by day, not in pain, but in silence. He didn't ask for much, didn't confess, didn't apologize. If he had regrets, he carried them alone. One morning, the nurses found him still. The window open, the city breathing beyond, his chest no longer rising, his hands finally still. They called it compassionate release. But what they gave him was not peace. It was just a longer hallway to the same end. A brief walk through old air before the final curtain. No headlines now, no flowers. Just a line in a file. A death certificate with a name that once ruled London. Reggie Kray had left the prison. But the prison never truly left him. There is a cemetery in Chingford where the grass grows quietly over stories too loud to forget. Not far from the road, nestled among the rows of etched stone and faded plastic flowers, are two graves that still draw whispers. Tourists walk past with lowered voices. Locals sometimes avoid the path altogether, because there, under the earth, lie the Kray twins, the artist, the diplomat, the executioners. Ronnie went first. Madness had already taken most of him before the body gave out. Medicated into silence, chained into numbness, he died in a place meant to hold the broken. They buried him with the respect he did not show others. A black car, a somber service, family, and a few ghosts in suits. They say some came out of fear, not love, just to make sure he really stayed down there. Years later, Reggie followed. Not with bullets or blood, but with cancer and silence. He died a free man on paper. But the kind of freedom they gave him came with tubes, with hospital sheets, with the final understanding that no gate leads backward. When they lowered him into the ground, it was near Ronnie. Not too close, not too far, just enough for the soil between them to breathe. The headstones are clean, the names carved bold. But there's something eerie about the way they sit together now. These brothers, who once ruled London's underworld with knives and charm. These twins who dined with movie stars and sentenced men to die in the same night. The grave doesn't blink. It does not remember the screams in back alleys or the champagne in club booths. It does not care about who was feared or loved or hated. The earth is democratic like that. It holds saints and monsters the same way, tight, cold, and without commentary. Visitors leave flowers, sometimes cigarettes, a glass of gin, a note. Some say thank you, others say good riddance, but no one ever speaks too loud. Because even in death, the Krays are watching, or at least, that's how it feels. As if the soil might shift, just slightly, as if the quiet might end. There's something poetic about the way they ended up. Buried not in grandeur, but in a modest patch of ground. No velvet ropes, no doormen, just names carved in stone. Ronald, Reginald, Kray. Two sides of the same storm, now silenced by roots and rain. But legends don't rot as easily as flesh. Their story lives in films, in books, in whispers exchanged in London pubs where old men sip slowly and say, "I saw them once." Kids grow up hearing the names like urban myths. Tour guides pause near the cemetery wall and tell half-true tales. And still, the ground does not speak. The grave has two names, but one shadow. It stretches across decades, across lives lost and lives spared, across a city still healing from everything they broke. And under that shadow, the twins lie still. Not gone, just buried. They still name-drop them at after-parties. The Kray twins, the East End kings in double-breasted suits. A gangster fairy tale told over cocktails in Soho lounges and film premieres in Leicester Square. The story always starts with a smirk. "I met Reggie once," or "Ronnie shook Sinatra's hand, you know." And just like that, the blood gets polished into myth, the screams muffled under the velvet of nostalgia. It didn't take long for Hollywood to bite down on their story. Clean lines, sharp suits, twisted loyalties, the perfect script. The Krays were not just criminals, they were characters. And in the glow of stage lights and camera flashes, morality fades. Violence becomes stylized. Charm becomes currency. Somewhere along the line, the murderers became marketable. Actors fought to play them. Writers sharpened dialogue to match their real-life menace. Biopics turned betrayal into box office. Directors framed Reggie's eyes to catch the ache of loss, Ronnie's stare to hint at inner torment. In doing so, they made it all. Beautiful, terrible men, made cinematic. Executions reimagined with slow-motion poetry and ambient music. But off-screen, the line blurred even more. Some celebrities in the 1960s and 70s didn't just admire the twins from afar. They walked into their clubs, drank their champagne, laughed with their enforcers, some out of thrill, others out of fear, and a few, maybe, because they believed in the myth that these were not just gangsters, these were protectors of their own, gentlemen to their friends, butchers to their enemies, and that myth, it lingers. You'll see it now in magazine interviews, where a pop star recalls her uncle once working security at one of the Kray's clubs, or in podcasts, where comedians flirt with the idea that Ronnie wasn't really mad, just misunderstood. There's a strange romance that clings to them, a fascination with power that doesn't flinch at blood, as long as the suit fits right and the accent sounds loyal. But beneath that charm, the truth stays ugly. There were no rules, only consequences, and for every grinning story told under party lights, there's a widow somewhere who remembers the way the door slammed before her husband vanished. There's a child who grew up wondering why the wallpaper still smelled like fear. Still, the Kray myth marches on. Luxury fashion brands nod to their style in winter collections. Nightclubs throw vintage East End nights with black and white posters of the twins on the walls. Fans quote them without knowing who they were quoting. And somewhere in the blur of history and hype, the real brothers fade behind the versions people prefer. The red carpet rolls on, clean now, sanitized, but you can still see it, if you look hard enough. The faint shadow of old blood, right there, beneath the heels and headlines. A reminder that fame has a short memory, and legends, no matter how brutal, tend to get invited back in, as long as they make good stories. The streets remember. Even when the names are whispered less and the headlines have faded, the East End holds their footprints like wet concrete that never quite dried. The old pubs still creak with stories. The alleys still echo with the sound of hurried footsteps, of promises made in back rooms and threats growled between cigarette drags. You can almost hear the scratch of a match being struck under the hush of dusk, the slow exhale of someone watching, always watching. Ask the barkeep if he's old enough. He won't say much, not at first, but if the night is quiet and the drink is right, he might lean in and mutter, "Used to be different round here." And you'll know exactly what he means. There's a tension in the air, faint now, but stubborn. A memory that refuses to leave the bones of these buildings. Bethnal Green, Whitechapel, Shoreditch before it got glossy and expensive. These places were once ruled by unspoken codes. You didn't talk to the police. You didn't cross the firm. You didn't ask where the blood on the tiles came from. The Krays didn't just own clubs and collect payments, they owned silence. And even now, decades later, that silence still hums through the brickwork. Sometimes you'll find graffiti, not the bold, political kind, but careful nods. A pair of faces sketched near the railway arches, a crown scratched into wood beneath a pub bench. Kids might not know who put it there, but the locals do. And some still nod at it, out of habit or reverence or something darker, Taxi drivers tell the stories best, not always accurately, but with feeling. My dad saw Ronnie once, they'll say, glancing at you in the rear view. Said he walked like he owned the ground, like he was the ground. Then comes the pause, a slight shake of the head. Wouldn't cross him, not even now. They laugh, but it's the kind of laugh that covers a shiver. The Krays became ghosts long before they died. Their power wasn't just in fists and blades, it was in the myth that grew like ivy around everything they touched. And myths don't die. They mutate. They settle into walls and whispers. They become part of the local accent, the street names, the caution in your step after dark. Even the newer residents, the ones sipping artisan coffee where an old boxing club used to be, they feel it. They don't know what they feel, but they sense it. The past brushing up against the present. Not loudly, just enough to make you glance over your shoulder at night. That's the East End's secret. It never forgets. And if you stand still long enough, really still, you might hear them too. Footsteps echoing through time. A door closing that hasn't existed in years. Or just a voice, low and amused, saying, "Tell 'em we were here," and the bricks will nod. Because they know. The empire crumbled, but the question lingered. Where did it all go? The nightclubs, the safe houses, the envelopes slipped under doors, the crooked cash handed over with a nod and a wink. For all the flashbulbs and front pages, for all the suits and champagne, the real currency of the Krays had been fear. And when the fear faded, so did the fortune. The buildings still stand, some of them. Others have been swallowed up by new developments. Gleaming glass facades built over blood-stained bricks. No blue plaques, no guided tours. Just quiet transformations. A butcher shop turned into a cafe. A bookmaker's office, now a vape lounge. But if you look close, you'll see it a crack in the wall. A rusted metal door that never opens. A reinforced hatch behind a kitchen cupboard. The money, though, that's harder to trace. Some say it went into offshore accounts, siphoned off before the final fall. Others whisper about safety deposit boxes buried in private vaults, untouched for decades, filled with rolled banknotes and pocket watches once owned by men who vanished without a word. There were rumors of suitcases passed hand to hand, dropped in train stations, left in taxi boots. But rumors are easy, proof, less so. When the twins went down, they took the fear with them. Without the Krays to enforce it, debts were forgotten, loyalties dissolved. The ones they paid cops, judges, councilmen in clean suits and darker hearts, they moved on. Some washed their hands clean, others didn't need to. The past is a convenient thing to bury when your hands hold the pen that rewrites it. A few of the old crew tried to hold on. Opened pubs, ran protection gigs on a smaller scale. But without the twins, without the myth, they were just old men in long coats, shouting stories no one wanted to hear. Some ended up dead in stairwells. Some drank themselves into silence. A few, incredibly, found God, or pretended to. The properties once under their thumb shifted ownership like ghosts changing hosts. A nightclub burned mysteriously in the early hours. Another was sold for pennies, only to be flipped weeks later to a developer with the right handshake. The Krays had ruled with a code, but the men who came after? They knew no such thing. They were cleaner, quieter, less cinematic, and far more dangerous in the long run. And yet, in the corners of East London, in those few places untouched by glass towers and artisan shops, people still remember. Not fondly, not with praise, but with the same reverence you give a storm that passed through and flattened everything, then moved on. The estate didn't just crumble, it evaporated, like smoke curling from a spent match. But the name? That stayed. It lingers in the concrete, in the way an old man glances over his shoulder before telling you a tale, in the hush that falls when someone says, "They used to run this place." Money vanishes, buildings fall, but legends, they collect rent forever. The truth died a long time ago. What's left is the echo, shaped and reshaped by voices who never walked the same streets, never saw the fear in the eyes of a man handed a death sentence with a handshake. The Krays became more than criminals, they became myth. And myths are useful. You can sell them, rewrite them, dress them up in cinema and call it history. It started with the papers, even before the trial. They couldn't help themselves, two handsome twins, sharp suits, sharp tongues, running the underworld like kings with crowns of brass knuckles. The headlines wrote themselves. London's gangster royalty, the firm, the Gemini twins. It was spectacle, and the city drank it in like gin. Then came the books, some written by insiders, others by those who'd never been within 10 streets of Bethnal Green. Reggie's own words, scrawled from a prison cell, tried to set the record straight, or at least tilt it in his favor. Ghostwriters followed, sensationalists, truth seekers, opportunists. Everyone wanted a slice of the story. But with every new version, the edges blurred. Villains became anti-heroes, violence became charisma, fear became folklore, film followed close behind. One actor, then two, then more. Each new portrayal giving the twins a different shade. Sometimes tragic, sometimes monstrous, sometimes charming. The screen glowed with their legend's slick dialogue, stylized fights, a London dripping in shadow and cigarette smoke. The kind of story people could watch from the safety of a theater seat and think, weren't they something? But the real London, the one that bled under their boots, doesn't always make the cut. Documentaries came too. Interviews with former associates, cops, lovers, hangers-on, grainy photos, cigarettes burning down between nervous fingers. Some spoke with awe, some with bitterness, a few with regret. But even the regret sold well. Because by then, the Krays weren't men anymore. They were merchandise. Tour guides pointed at buildings long since changed, whispering about the murders that happened upstairs. Tourists leaned in, took selfies, bought postcards with the twins' faces framed in black and red. East End shops sold mugs with Reggie's signature, T-shirts with Ronnie's stare. They became stories people told at parties. My uncle knew them, someone might say, nodding like it was gospel. My dad drank with Ronnie once, truth optional, belief automatic. Because in the space between fear and fiction, a legend breathes better. It's easier to remember the charm, the suits, the clubs, the swagger. Harder to remember the bodies, the widows, the terrified silence that once filled entire neighborhoods. Myths are cleaner. Myths don't cry. So the twins live on, not in blood, but in celluloid and paperback and streaming cues. Every few years, someone retells it, adds a new spin, a new actor, a new quote that maybe was never said, and people eat it up. Because deep down, we all love a gangster, as long as the danger is past and the bullets are blanks. Ronnie and Reggie left the stage in handcuffs, but the myth still gets top billing. Before the suits, before the knives, before the names echoed through courtrooms and corner pubs like ghosts, there were just two boys, small, sharp-eyed, and inseparable, born minutes apart in a world that would come to fear them. But it did not start with fear. It started with a crib shared between two brothers in a working-class home in the heart of the East End. They were born during wartime. Air raid sirens screamed through London's nights like broken promises. The city trembled, but in their mother's arms, the twins were quiet. London was already cracked and bruised when Ronnie and Reggie Kray took their first breaths. Maybe the city made them, or maybe they made each other. They were close, closer than most twins ever are. If one cried, the other tensed. If one laughed, the other beamed. They had their own language, their own rhythm, their own laws before they ever wrote them for the streets. When one got in trouble at school, the other took the punishment too. Not because he had to, but because he wouldn't let his brother stand alone. That kind of bond can build an empire, or burn it down. Their father was often gone, a boxer turned deserter, a shadow more than a presence. But their mother, Violet, she was the Sunday. She was the law in that household. The love, the forgiveness. She believed her boys could do no wrong, even when wrong was all they did. She dressed them sharp and told them they were meant for more. And maybe they believed her a little too much. They boxed young, fought bare knuckle before they ever signed a gym card. They had talent, yes, but more than that. They had fury. Controlled, practiced, but never far from spilling over. Coaches whispered about their potential, but also their danger. Reggie could smile while breaking your nose. Ronnie didn't need a reason to throw the first punch, or the last. But even then, weren't they still just boys? Boys playing with the idea of power. Boys wanting to be seen. In a city that overlooked people like them every day, they made themselves unforgettable. Maybe that was the real beginning. Not the crimes, not the deaths, but the craving to be remembered. Sometimes people ask if they were born bad, but that's too easy. The truth is quieter, more uncomfortable. They were born into broken streets and broken promises. They were shaped by silence, war, and the worship of strength. And by the time the world took notice, the boys were already gone, replaced by something colder, sharper, louder. But behind every headline, every whispered warning, every corpse left to bleed in a back room, there was still the shadow of two kids who used to share a football, a corner bed, and dreams too dangerous to speak aloud. No one asks what they were like before the blood, before the fame, before the fear. But maybe they were, once, just boys. Sleep now. The Krays are gone. The streets they once ruled no longer echo with their footsteps, no longer tense at their names. The pubs stand, the alleys remain, but the fear has thinned into memory. Their suits are moth-eaten, their clubs turned to cafes, their empire scattered to dust. You are safe now. The twins are buried, and the ground above them grows grass like it would for anyone else. It was a story that began in the cradle, rose through fists, and ended in coffins. Brothers who built kingdoms out of silence and smoke, who stitched their names into London's bones. But legends grow heavy, and even kings fall. Ronnie lies under earth, padded by madness. Reggie beside him with regrets that even time could not bleach away. Their myth lives on in whispers, in films, in stories told over too many drinks. But the men themselves, those storms in suits, are gone. The East End no longer bows to their memory. Children play in the streets where once a glance could spell a death sentence. Old men tell the tales now, not with fear, but with distance, as if remembering a dream they half believed. The danger has passed. The door has closed. Let your shoulders ease. Let the weight of their empire fall away. You do not need to listen for their footsteps anymore. No knocks at the door, no shadows in the smoke. Just quiet, just night. Rest, because the twins are no longer watching. The world has turned, and their chapter is finished. History holds them now, not the streets. And history, for all its noise, always ends in silence. So breathe. You survived their story, and now you can let it go. Sleep. The Krays are gone.